Hasn't this been a great conference? Everybody enjoyed this? This has been really good. Well, we are excited about this evening, and we'll get you out early enough so that you can make any commitments that you might have. And let me just mention that there are still opportunities for you to get a number of books out there, and Logos software is still there. Our speaker tonight, John Stonestreet, has some books and some other CDs. Let me just mention that, Making Sense of Your World, a Biblical Worldview, and then also Making Sense of Worldviews. They're actually, because these are MP3s, there's 5 different talks on each one of those: Christianity and culture, faith in the real world, and real answers for tough questions. So make a point to get some of these great materials to feed your soul and to learn a little bit more about some of these issues. And I know you're going to really appreciate our speaker tonight. John Stonestreet should not be an unfamiliar voice to too many of you, because you probably hear him on Breakpoint. He is a senior speaker and fellow with the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and is the co-host of Breakpoint with Eric Metaxas. He also is the voice of The Point, and if you're not familiar with that, I'm sure he'll spend a little bit of time talking about the various radio features that he is involved with as well. He is also the senior content advisor for Summit Ministries just down the road, and if you have young people going off to college, they need to go to Summit first, so I certainly do recommend that. He is a graduate of Bryan College and also a graduate of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Please, if you could, welcome John Stonestreet.
Thank you, Kirby. It's it's obligatory to say it's an honor to be here, but it actually is. I mean, I don't know how much I have to add after the lineup that you already heard from, and it's a little bit intimidating. I mean, I kind of cut a lot of my worldview teeth on a lot of Kirby Anderson books, and Norm Geisler was the mentor of my mentors, so if that kind of puts that in perspective. So, but it is really an honor to be here, and the topic tonight, I'm hoping that it makes sense. It's somewhat of a set of thoughts in progress for me. And really the genesis of it was a Breakpoint commentary that we did last year. And Don Williams emailed, and we kind of went back and forth on it. The idea of the cultural imagination. And it really was stemming out of the topic of our day, a topic that has been talked about already at the conference, marriage, and specifically same-sex marriage. And I don't know about you, but do you feel like our arguments for traditional marriage aren't hearable in our culture? Does that make sense? In other words, if you stack up on a purely argumentative side, one side of this issue and the other side of this issue, clearly we have the better arguments. But why is it that a slogan like marriage equality is so far outdoing a well thought out set of arguments for traditional marriage? I mean, Robert George's, Sharif Gurgis, and Ryan Anderson's book, What is Marriage?, lays out this view of what they call conjugal marriage in a way that is very compelling, very powerful. It makes an awful lot of sense, but yet it seems to be defeated by a slogan and a little Facebook meme, marriage equality, doesn't it? Why is that the case? Now, it may be the difference because they're using the term marriage equality and we're using the term conjugal marriage. It sounds like marriage got a disease somewhere along the line, like my friend Eric Tietzel says. But how do we actually understand that what we're dealing with might not be a struggle of arguments as much as it is a struggle of the imagination? Let me give you my punchline with 2 quotes. J. Gresham Machen, who was involved in so many of the top kind of theological debates at the early part of the 20th century, said this: false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer, he said, and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there, which is something for a Calvinist to say, if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which, get this, by the resistless force of logic prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. In other words, we've heard the phrase, ideas have what? Consequences. But he's adding another chapter to that story. Not only that ideas have consequences, but ideas have context. In some context, ideas can be heard. And in other context, they cannot be heard. And we could see this if we trace the history of ideas. Darwin wasn't the first one to suggest that all living things came from a common ancestor. Why was Darwinism so powerful when he articulated it the way he did? It wasn't just how he articulated it. It was actually the context, the cultural history in which he threw out this idea that made it so absolutely powerful. I think Machen here is right that false ideas can actually prevent truth from actually being heard. But here's what I want to suggest, that ideas don't just get to culture. In fact, they most often don't get to culture just through arguments. Ideas often get to culture through the imagination. It's not just that ideas are argued. Here's another way to put it, specifically when it comes to something like same-sex marriage. My friend Eric Tietzel, the director of the Manhattan Declaration, puts it this way. He says, what if we have thought that this whole struggle for marriage in our culture has been a boxing match of arguments, when in reality, it's been a beauty pageant? And instead of 2 or 3 guys getting in the ring and slugging it out, and we're going to get behind the winner in a David versus Goliath sort of way, really what's happening is there's a beauty pageant going on, and in that beauty pageant, there are 300 million judges across America, and we have been fighting a battle of arguments when in fact, it's been a battle of the imagination. So let me temper Machen's quote with another one from C.S. Lewis. And maybe, Don, you can tell me where this came from. I've seen it quoted a couple times, and I can't find the source. It drives me crazy. You can help me with this later. C.S. Lewis said this, that the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones being argued, but the ones that are assumed. The ones that color the context. Now, I see this because I work with teenagers. Now, I was speaking to a group of high school and college students, or high school students down in South Carolina several years ago, 10 years ago, and I made a sarcastic comment, which I sometimes do because I have that spiritual gift. And I made a sarcastic comment about a movie that was popular at the time called The Notebook. How many of you guys have ever heard or seen The Notebook? If you're a guy, you owe us an explanation. The movie The Notebook, of course, classic love story, classic movie here. And I made a sarcastic comment about it, and I went on, forgot I said it. Now, when you get finished talking, sometimes people come up and talk to you, and that's often a lot of fun. Sometimes you see people coming to talk to you, and you see the look on their face, and you think to yourself, I don't think I want to talk to that person, right? This happened to me in South Carolina, because I'd made this sarcastic comment, forgotten about it. After I get done speaking, 3 female students and a female teacher make a beeline to me. And I saw the look on their face and thought, I don't want to talk to them, so I tried to get away. And as I was trying to escape, I got caught up in this group of students. You ever played football? There's this phrase called hearing the footsteps. It means you're going across the middle and you're about to get drilled from the blind side, and you can't see them, you know, but you can. I heard the footsteps. It was the strangest experience, because usually when you hear the footsteps, it's an overweight man. In this case, there was 3 females. And I turned around, and this lady glared at me with gritted teeth and said, what's wrong with The Notebook? Now, if you know anything about the movie, it's about an older woman who has Alzheimer's or dementia. She can't remember her life. She's in a home. Her husband comes and visits her and reads to her their love story out of a notebook, right? And by the end of the movie, she remembers who he is, and they fall in love all over again. And they have another night together, of love before, her disease steals it away. And they said, that was a beautiful picture of love. And you made a sarcastic comment about it. And I said, you're right. That was a beautiful picture of love. But you forgot at the end of the story, but you forgot what was in the notebook that supposedly got them to the end of the story. Do you remember how the story went? Their love story? One summer, there were these 2 teenagers who were in heat, and they see each other, and they're overwhelmed with this strong feeling of emotion and passion and so on for each other, and they can't deny their feelings, and so they're magically drawn to each other, even though her dad says he's a bum. He kind of was a bum, but that's just what mean dads do. They want to make their daughters miserable. And so anyway, she disobeys her dad, and she jumps into bed with him, and then they get split up, and they go off to war. She goes off to be a nurse. He goes off to fight in the war. They get split up. She doesn't know if he's still alive. She ends up treating this other guy, who's badly injured, even though she has these strong feelings. This other guy develops feelings for her, and he falls in love with her and proposes, and she says yes, but she still has these strong feelings. And so even though she's made a commitment to marry this other guy, her feelings overwhelm her, and she runs away from that guy and runs and jumps back into bed with this other guy. And 50 years later, they're still married, and those strong feelings are still there, just like in real life, right? Now here's what it is. That movie never makes an argument about the definition of love, but it assumes a definition of love, doesn't it? And the definition of love that it assumes is that love is something that happens to you. It's a set of feelings that never go away, right? Do the married couples in here, do the feelings go away sometimes? I know, you can't say it out loud. Okay, I get it. No, but of course the answer is what? Yeah, love, right, isn't dependent on feelings, because if it is dependent on feelings, it never lasts. And that movie not only gave us a definition of love, which said it's a set of feelings that never go away, it actually assaulted the right definition of love, which is that love is a commitment that one makes for the good of another person. And in this movie, your feelings justify the breaking of a commitment. Now you say, John, what does all this have to do with your topic? Here it is. That movie never argued a view of love and marriage, but it certainly carried with it and embedded into the imagination of those watching that film a particular definition of love and therefore marriage, didn't it? And by the way, is that a pretty common definition of love that we get in music and movies and TV shows, right? Now this is what's striking me, is I often think that the battle of ideas in any society is the battle over definitions. But our definitions are rarely taught. Our definitions are most often caught from the culture around us. It's just embedded in the stories and the narratives and the experiences that we have and what we have right now that's undermining marriage. Look, you can do a damage control assessment if you'd like, and same-sex marriage hasn't done near the damage to marriage that this bad definition of love, embodied in laws like no-fault divorce laws and so on, that love is a set of feelings, and when the feelings go away, therefore the marriage is what? Over. Do you see what I'm talking about? What if we've been fighting this battle with arguments, when in reality, at the root of it is imagination? Maybe the ideas get to us in a different form. In my mind, this is where the dialogue or the conversation about worldview needs to go. I work for the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Chuck obviously was one of the primary spokesperson for the concept of a Christian worldview. There's a lot of definitions of worldview. I like this one, by the way, because it's the one from my book. A worldview is the framework of basic beliefs that we have, whether we know it or not, that shapes our view of and for the world. The reason in our book that we put this definition, whether we know it or not, is because if you went up to the average person on the street and you said, hey, what's your worldview? They'd probably run away from you, right? Except in Manitou Springs. If you get a chance to go up to Manitou Springs, it's a hippie town. They'll sit down and smoke pot with you and talk about it all you want. But the idea of worldview is that it's very rarely something that's articulated. But what a worldview does, a worldview either allows you to see the world correctly or it prevents you from seeing the world correctly. So if I want to get to the root of what someone's worldview is, I can ask them, what do you believe about God? What do you believe about marriage? What do you believe about truth? What do you believe about the afterlife? We can go through the classic ultimate questions of origin, identity, meaning, morality, and destiny, and so on. And all of this matters. But I think at the end of the day, what someone's worldview is essentially this: the world that they think they live in. This is what Jim Sire in his book, The Universe Next Door, I think was trying to communicate, right? I mean, he called it that someone can be next door to you and think they live in a different world, right? And so the question is, whose world do we live in? Do we live in God's world, right? Or do we live in Oprah's world? Do we live in Bono's world, right? Or do we live in Richard Dawkins' world? Whose world is it that we live in? In other words, which world is the real one? Because Christianity doesn't just give us, it doesn't just propose a set of moral truths. It doesn't just propose answers to a set of philosophical questions. It actually answers this question. It says that the world in which we live is a world that came from God. And in the midst of what came from God, there was something that went wrong. We call it the fall. And yet in that fall, and even in the event of the fall, there's a seed of redemption that's going to bring restoration and new life and renewal to all things. It is that large story of creation, fall, redemption. Creation, fall, redemption. This is the world we live in. In other words, what Christianity suggests is this: the only world that we've ever lived in is one that has been created by God, right? The only world we've ever lived in is one that's deeply impacted by the fall, and the only world we've ever lived in is one that is being actively renewed by King Jesus because of what he did on the cross. This is actually the world we live in. And yet when we go to somebody else and we talk with someone who has different answers to the same questions or has a different vision of reality, it's not just that they disagree with us about marriage or they disagree with us about love or they disagree with us about truth. It's that we actually imagine the world to be a completely different place than the one we live in. And this is why fighting legal battles without caring for the cultural imagination is a fool's game. I remember being in a lot of the early meetings when same-sex marriage was really hitting the culture, and there was a tagline. I can't tell you how many times I've heard it. Every time the vote goes to the people support natural traditional marriage. We heard it. We would go to these meetings, these strategy meetings, and the strategy was get the vote to the people. Because every time the vote goes to the people, they end up supporting this. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, that gives us 5 years tops. In reality, it gave us 2 years. This week, someone passed to me a white paper, a statement paper on what to do about marriage. And the answer was the same, a political battle. But he actually said, this white paper actually said, the reason we've lost marriage is we didn't have enough money. This guy does not know the teens and 20-somethings that I know. Look, I worked at a Christian college in southeast Tennessee, Bryan College. Very conservative place. Third homeschool, third public school, third Christian school. Made for great lunchtime conversations. I work for Summit Ministries up the road now and the Colson Center. I work with a lot of teenagers. And when we use the phrase, let's preserve traditional marriage, they look back at me like, I don't even know what you're talking about anymore. We need to be aware of something, that just because we share the same vocabulary doesn't mean we share the same dictionary. They don't know what traditional marriage is. And Don and I were talking about this, and by the way, based on what he and I had a conversation about, you need to get his paper if you weren't at his session and read through it, because we agree on this. It's so important that we understand that any sort of language of preserving culture, preserving something like American culture, preserving traditional values, that is lost. We're not preserving anything anymore. It's no longer time to preserve, it's time to rebuild. The categories, the definitions, the ideas, the imagination has been shifted. Even so that many conservatives, let me give you another stat to me that tells it, that tells the story on this. We hear this over and over, and it's true that when you actually poll millennials about pro-life issues, that millennials are more pro-life than their parents are. Isn't that good news? But they're also more likely to drive their friends to an abortion clinic if they think they can help them that way. Now, you and I, we think about that and we think, how can people hold that together without their head exploding? But you know why? Because in a millennial mind, there is no such thing as morality that is bigger than their own life. There is no imagination that morality is something that applies to all people at all times. If it's their moral position, it's nothing more than their moral position. And the worst sin to commit is not having a moral framework. It's not having moral convictions. The worst sin is imposing someone's moral convictions on their neighbor. Right? So we can win the polls and still lose an awful lot of babies. Let me give you an example of how I think this cultural imagination has shifted, and we'll get into something a little bit more specific. Just think of it. When I was growing, think of it this way. Let's compare the two important television shows when I was growing up. I grew up in the 80s. I'm a child of the 80s. All the good music was then, right? Good hairstyles. What was the most important popular television show of the 1980s? The one that framed the entire decade. If you grew up in the 80s, you grew up with this family, you watched it with them. What was it? The Cosby Show, right? That was the most important television show of the 1980s. 1 decade later, what was the most important television show of the 1990s? Well, Friends. That was the most popular. Historians of television, because for some reason we have them, say that the most important television show of the 90s was Seinfeld. That shows prior to Seinfeld tended to look more like The Cosby Show. Shows after Seinfeld tend to look like Seinfeld. Now listen, that is 1 decade apart. This show didn't just have different morals. These shows didn't just have different morals. These shows actually portrayed two very different views of reality. The world of the Cosby Show was one in which family was where you went to get the answer to your problem. Seinfeld was a show in which family was often the source of your problem. Remember George's dad? Right? Now let's do the math. Let's carry it on out. So this is the 80s, the Cosby Show. Seinfeld was the 90s. As Seinfeld was going off the air, another show hit the airwaves. Will and Grace. Well, what was interesting about Will and Grace? It's not because that there was a prominent gay character. Other sitcoms had prominent gay characters. Here's the difference, is that, and it's no pun intended here, Will in that show was the straight guy. Now, here's what I mean by that. Will played the role in Will and Grace that Cliff Huxtable played in The Cosby Show. It wasn't that there just was a homosexual character in that. It was that Will was the place where Grace got her questions answered and her problem solved. Do you see that shift? And suddenly we have a different imagination. But that's still interesting because Seinfeld was this way of living in the city. So was Friends, right? They were set in New York City. So was Will and Grace set in New York City. The show of this generation, and it's kind of winding down, but it's very powerful. Two shows, Glee and Modern Family. Glee and Modern Family. Now, isn't that interesting? Modern Family doesn't argue that one form of family is better than another. Modern Family just says the modern family is this family plus this family and this family, whatever family works for you. The interesting thing to me about Glee is not only that you have openly sexual characters in high school. We had that with Beverly Hills 90210, or 90210 as well. There you go. That's what I meant to say. But in Glee, here's what's interesting. Beverly Hills 90210 was set in Beverly Hills. Where's Glee set? Central Indiana. Do you see what I'm talking about? So suddenly the values of New York are the values of Central Indiana for the emerging generation. These are many worlds being fabricated. This is the imagination that's being shaped. And if we're going to understand how to make a case for the Christian worldview in our culture, we've got to do a great job, I think, understanding the times in which we live. Let me give you a little model for understanding the culture that helps me. We know that God has given us the text of Scripture. This is not just incidental to the Christian life, it's central to the Christian life. It's where we get God's agenda for the world and God's agenda for His people. So Scripture lays out an agenda. The hard part, of course, is that we're supposed to live out this agenda in the context of our own times. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's an awful lot of things that are in the Bible that we don't deal with, and there's a lot of things that we deal with that aren't in the Bible. This is why a lot of left-leaning evangelicals will say Jesus never talked about same-sex marriage, because He didn't talk about same-sex marriage. You can look in the Bible for a lot of things. You can look for biotechnology, not there, right? You can look for nanotechnology, not there. I don't know you guys well at all, but I don't think any of you looked out the window this morning and thought, oh no, the Philistines are outside. What am I going to do, right? Now, good news, if the Philistines were outside, there's like 40 chapters, what to do in case of Philistine. It's mainly just pray. But what we did is we looked outside and said, human cloning is outside. What are we going to do? Same-sex marriage is outside. What are we going to do? Miley Cyrus is outside. What are we going to do? Right? That's the scariest of all, if you ask me. So this is what we have. And so the context of our times has to create questions that drive us back into the text of Scripture. Not that these two things are equal players because they're on the same level here. That's just the way the model works. Only one of these things is authoritative, the Scripture. But there's got to be a conversation going on between God's Word and between God's world. I remember a very insightful bumper sticker that I saw years ago. If Jesus is the answer, what's the question? Right? What is the question the culture's, what's the conversation the culture wants to have? And this goes back. We say we need to preserve biblical values to a group of people who don't understand even what the word value should mean. We're having a conversation that the culture's not having with us. I just finished up the manuscript of a new book being published by Regal later on this year. I co-authored it with Sean McDowell. Sean and I wrote this together on same-sex marriage. And the thesis of the book is not same-sex marriage, why not? Or same-sex marriage, oh no. It's same-sex marriage, what now? Because on a legal level, It's almost here. On a popular level, friends, it's here. And now we've got to start wrestling with the discipleship priorities. What do I do when the gay married couple moves in next door? What do I do when the coworker invites me to a celebration party for their adoption? What do we do if one part of a gay couple becomes a Christian? Do we actually tell them now to go get a divorce? These are very, very difficult questions. And it's time we start wrestling with them. Among the many things we looked at for this book, one of the most interesting to me, fascinating, was a book written by two gay activists, last names Kirk and Madsen. It's a book called After the Ball. If you have not read this book, it's a little bit difficult to find. You can usually find a used copy on Amazon. You need to read it. After the Ball was written in 1989. In 1989, the first line of that book, the opening line of that book was this, in 1989, "The gay revolution has failed." That's how they opened their book in 1989. And they went on to identify the problems in the gay movement and then also offer a step-by-step strategy. In fact, the subtitle was "How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s." So in 1989, the gay revolution has failed. In 2012, we have the tsunami of same-sex marriage. 20 years, a little over 20 years, how much has changed? One of the most powerful things that they point out in that book is that one of the main problems with the gay movement, they said, was the stereotypes that people had in their minds about gay people that were perpetuated by gay individuals themselves. They realized something, that the cultural imagination of America wasn't big enough for the flamboyant character. I mean, we would laugh at him on a sitcom, but we didn't want him living next door. And they actually went after their own community and said, we have to have a conversation with the culture where the culture is. And you know what? They laid out a game plan and it worked. It absolutely worked. It's one of the most stunning. In fact, the gay revolution will go down as the most successful social revolution of recent memory, because it's been that successful. And I think that's something we can learn. We got to have a conversation between where we are and where the culture is when it comes to marriage and when it comes to family and when it comes to truth by and large. And this is why we say we know we need biblical exegesis, but we also need good cultural exegesis. And in light of that here, I want to actually offer 3 questions that I think we need to ask about our culture, specifically trying to get at the cultural imagination and the sort of world that the culture thinks, people in our culture think that they live in. The first question is simply this: what's going on really? Now, I put that word really at the end and I underline it for a really important reason. Because I think Christians, by and large, look at culture and they often ask what's going on, and then we panic, right? We're very reactionary as Christians, right? What's going on? Harry Potter, that sort of thing, right? And instead of asking that really question, we look at individual cultural icons or narratives or individual cultural stories or incidents or artifacts, and we respond to those without seeing kind of the move of culture, the shifting of culture. And this is exactly what happened, I think, when it came to same-sex marriage, is we fought this legislation over here and this legal battle over here, and we failed to realize that Hollywood had taken the narrative and swept it right out from under our feet and replaced it with an entirely new narrative about homosexuality, gay individuals, and same-sex marriage. So we need to ask the question, what's going on really? So for example, did Harry Potter happen? Yeah, but what's going on really was Harry Potter, Oprah Winfrey, the popularity of a Joel Osteen and a Rick Warren, and suddenly we realize what's going on really is this, that our culture is asking some really interesting spiritual questions. Second question, not only what's going on really, but why is it going on really? What's really behind it? Can I make a suggestion here? Same-sex marriage is not the root of anything. It's the fruit of a whole bunch of stuff. It's the end game. It's where culture has led us. Same-sex marriage is the result of the ideas of sexuality that were established in American culture. The ideas of people like Alfred Kinsey and Michel Foucault. Their ideas really did the damage. But you know what? Michel Foucault and Alfred Kinsey did not change the culture. Culture doesn't change with ideas alone. My take on this, and there's probably more to it, but my take on this is 3 things really start moving the cultural needle. One is ideas. You got to have ideas. They're not unimportant. But ideas themselves, how do they get from being words on a page of a book that no one can read and understand and actually make a difference, right? So there's 2 other things. Number 2, so to change culture, you need ideas. Secondly, you need champions. Popular champions. Alfred Kinsey's ideas didn't get into American culture by themselves. There were 2 champions of Alfred Kinsey's ideas that embedded those ideas in our culture. And they were champions in 2 of the most important fields imaginable. There was an educator and there was an artist. An educator and an artist took Kinsey's ideas and gave them to us in culture. Who was the educator? Mary Calderon, the founder of the Sexuality, Education, and Information Caucus of the United States. My friend Michael Craven, and Kirby, I know you know Michael. What's his website? We need to tell people about that because his stuff on this is fantastic. It's culturalapologetics.com maybe? Yeah, it's fabulous. But really, Calderon basically was the one who started sex education in American public schools. And her organization, which she founded out of the Kinsey Institute, was actually designed to start teaching in American public education Kinsey's views of sexuality. And so suddenly, sex education in some states is the only class that students have from kindergarten through 12th grade. Who was the artist? And I use this term somewhat loosely. Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner. Now, we look at Hefner and we say, well, he just started a girly mag. No. Hefner was a disciple of Alfred Kinsey. Hefner, by the way, gave Mary Calderon her first grant to get the Sexuality, Education, and Information Caucus of the United States off the ground. But Hugh Hefner actually said that his goal was to start a revolution. And it's hard to argue how powerful and impactful that was. But you know what? Even by themselves, they did not give us a sexual revolution. Not only with the ideas of Kinsey and the champions of Calderon and Hefner did we get the cultural revolution. There's a 3rd category of stuff. You need ideas, you need champions, and number 3, you need artifacts, stuff. We do not get the sexual revolution without internet pornography. Because suddenly, unlike when I was growing up, and I had to go, if I wanted to see some dirty pictures, I at least had to go look a convenience store clerk in the eye with my little red face, right? Now no one has to know. And the idea of Kinsey, that sexuality, there are no morals. Sexual morals for Alfred Kinsey is whatever people actually did. So the is determined the ought for Alfred Kinsey. And that's what this artifact actually mobilized. And suddenly, one of the things that got embedded into the cultural imagination of the West is the thing that ultimately gave us same-sex marriage. And that's this. Not only that sexuality does not have any moral boundaries, but secondly, sexuality is a radically privatized thing. And it's no one's business but your own. When I was writing a chapter for that book on same-sex marriage that we just sent off to the publisher, I was at a hotel room down in Florida, and I heard all this ruckus going on outside. And I opened the door, and there was a wedding happening there. And I started to think about the power of that institution. What was a wedding supposed to signify? Why does the bride wear a white dress? Right? We know, right? It was a sign of purity. That doesn't mean that anymore. That's a long-lost tradition. But historically, what happened at a wedding is 2 individuals got up and they said, we're going to marry each other, and the parents gave them away. And you know what's interesting? Every single person knows at that wedding ceremony what that couple is going to do that night. It ain't Victoria's Secret, you know what I'm saying? And it's good that everyone knows it. That was the point. Because then in the community, if anyone sees him with another woman or sees her with another man, something's not right. In other words, get this, sexuality is personal, but it's not private. Sexuality is a public good that can be contextualized in marriage, and that produces health and sustenance. But see, that was lost in the Keynesian idea where everyone, without anyone even needing to know, can just get on internet pornography all by themselves. And we're taking that to a whole new level. Just this past week, the FDA approved a generic form of the morning after pill to be given across the counter to girls of any age. So a girl who could be sexually abused or sexually pressured or is just living a sexually risky life, at least in order to get a morning after pill, she would have had to have faced her doctor. Now she has to face no one because no one is able to judge that act of sexuality. Does that make sense? So sexuality gets untethered from its public role in culture. This is an imagination thing. And so when we step up and say they don't have the right to have what they do to be called marriage, people can't even hear. In other words, it's something like this. Marriage historically has always been that institution which protects and justified sexuality. In our new imagination, what is marriage? Marriage is the thing, it's not that marriage protects sexuality or marriage justifies sexuality. Any form of sexuality justifies marriage. It's a radical shift in the way we imagine the world. And so the third question I think we need to get at is this: what's it like to live here? What's it like to live here? Cultures do one of two things. If you want to get to the heart of the cultural imagination, I think cultures do one of two things. Number one is they either humanize us or they dehumanize us. Cultural forces either reflect our humanity or they deny our humanity. I was going to move on, but let me throw this in. Do we live in a humanizing culture or a dehumanizing culture? It's very dehumanizing, isn't it? Can I just suggest that as negative and as depressing what I just said may have been about the cultural imagination being shifted, the church has a profound opportunity to be an agent of rehumanization in the midst of a culture that systemically and profoundly dehumanizes people. See, there's this false historical narrative that the pagans were all sexually free until those Christians came along and imposed their morality and made everyone prudish and miserable. But that's not the way the story goes. The way the story actually goes is that pagan cultures were so sexually exhausted that the sexual protection of marriage that Christianity gave, you can see this, by the way, in pre-Victorian to Victorian England, that shift. It was actually a breath of fresh air for a sexually exhausted culture. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think there's a lot of opportunity. So as our freedoms get restricted because of same-sex marriage, you guys have already talked about that, I don't need to go into that. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for Christians to offer a humanizing hope to a sexually exhausted, dehumanized culture. All that to say, let me give you just a handful of things that I think are informing the cultural imagination these days. The things that have actually shaped it. I'm going to move through these really quickly. Hopefully it'll give us some pegs to think about, and then I want to end with some marching orders, and then we'll call it a day. And maybe have just 5 or 10 minutes for questions, depending on how it goes. The first thing I think that's shaping the cultural imagination is that truth has been drowned in a sea of noise. This is what's happened in our cultural imagination is that we've given up the pursuit of wisdom for a pursuit of information. This is something I think that can't be underestimated. I grew up in a generation where if I wanted to know something, right, my mom would say, go what? Look it up. That's right. And what did she mean? Where was I supposed to look it up? In a book. That's right, right? And now it's go look it up, and it's go look it up where? In Google. That's right. Google or Wikipedia. This is a very different form of things because what happens is that information becomes disconnected from other information, and instead of becoming a path forward to wisdom, it leads us, I'll put it this way, it leads us into a profoundly pragmatic approach to life in the world. This is what's happened to education. See, there's this bad understanding of education. That is that you have money and that place has a degree and you give them money and they fill your head with information and poof, you're an educated person, right? As Neil Postman said, there's not even an understanding of what constitutes an educated person anymore. Education for what? You say, John, what does that mean? Here's what it means, is I think in an age of too much information, it's not that the truth is not present, it's that the truth is not heard. I tell parents this all the time. You're nothing more than one stop on the information bus of the week, and there's a lot of stops. So the stop at the church, the bus stop at the church, when people come to church or when people go to small group or when parents talk to their kids, that stop has got to be more than just imparting information. It's got to be the sort of stop not only where people receive the true, the good, and the beautiful, but where they learn the skill of telling the difference between the true, the good, and the beautiful from the lies and the counterfeit. To reshape the cultural imagination, we can't just dump information into a sea of information, right? If you dump information into a sea of information, that true information is just going to get what? It's just going to get lost and drowned out. So I think that's a key point. I was going to skip over this there. I'll give you this quote from T.S. Eliot, who apparently looked like Herman Munster. I didn't know that until I saw that picture. But okay, here's what he wrote in 1934, The Courses from the Rock. Look at this. The endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention and endless experiment brings knowledge of motion but not of stillness, knowledge of speech but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? One of the applications, and Don spoke a little bit about this in his session too, so I point you to some of the things he says, and he's much more of an expert on this than I am. But evangelicals are never going to be able to impact the cultural imagination if we do not get better at reading the Bible. When we break the Bible up into little bits of information to give us moralistic or therapeutic nudges in our life, what we are doing is failing to reshape in Christian discipleship the imaginations of people who need to realize that the cultural story they find themselves in Monday to Friday is not the real story. The biblical story is the real story. I think it is the task of Christian discipleship in the 21st century to convince the church that they live out of the biblical story, not the cultural story. This is what happened in the early centuries. The early apostles started to proclaim there's a different king. It's not that king, it's King Jesus. There's a different way. It's the way of Jesus. It's not the way of money. It's not the way of fame and power and influence like it was in the Roman society. It's actually this way where the least becomes the first, and the least becomes the greatest, and the last becomes the first. This is actually a different way of seeing things. But we have made, I remember reading this quote from Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who was part of a lot of the ecumenical conversations of the 20th century, a Jewish guy. And he said, it's strange to me how committed to the Bible you guys seem to be, and yet how much like pagans you handle it. There's great evidence of this in the same-sex marriage debate. Because you've got evangelicals on the left saying Jesus never talked about same-sex marriage, so therefore it's not important. And then you've got people on the right saying, Leviticus, quoting Leviticus. Homosexuality is an abomination, as they're ignoring all the other parts of Leviticus which talk about shellfish and wearing clothes of two different fabrics being an abomination. What does this tell us? What this tells us is that evangelicals often don't know how to understand and read the Bible. We take it in bits and pieces. This is one of the things that Schaeffer talked about. We proof text Bible verses here and there when really what Scripture is trying to get us to realize is that we live out of God's world. We don't live in the cultural world. An Anglican theologian, Oliver O'Donovan, talks about this. He says, we will read the Bible seriously only when we use it to guide our thoughts towards a comprehensive moral viewpoint and not merely to articulate disconnected moral claims. At some level in the same-sex marriage thing, this is part of the stuff we wrote in the Bible, we're going to have to own up to the fact that we were pretty silent when marriage was collapsing in the last several generations. It seems highly selective that we are so angry at same-sex marriage legislation when we were really kind of quiet on no-fault divorce legislation. Not everyone, but it's certainly not the same. The second thing I think is shaping the cultural imagination, not only the drowning of truth and noise, but this overall loss of virtue. This is what Lewis, of course, called men without chest in his book, The Abolition of Man. If you've never read The Abolition of Man, it's one of those unbelievable books that's far more true today than it ever was. It's unreal, especially that first chapter, Men Without Chest. Here's what he says. It says, it still remains true that no justification of virtue will enable a man to be virtuous. You know this. In other words, just because we know the right thing doesn't mean we will actually what? Do the right thing. Without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. The head rules the belly through the chest. Now, what's he talking about there? What's he talking about is just quite simple. Aristotle said that the head was the seat of the reason and the belly was the seat of the passion. And so the goal of life is to have your head rule the belly, because you don't want the belly ruling the head. Does that make sense? My friend Mike, but here's the thing is, when it really comes down to a battle between the head and the belly, who usually wins? The belly. My friend Mike Miller puts it this way. He goes, imagine the belly is like an 800-pound gorilla, right? And it's down there going, feed me, feed me, feed me, I want. And the head is like an 80-pound professor with a bow tie, right? And it's up there going, we ought not do this because Immanuel Kant. Who's going to win between the gorilla, right? Who wins between the gorilla and the professor? The gorilla wins every time. And so what Lewis said is we have to have a well-cultivated chest. In other words, a virtue. I mean, it's essentially a word for virtue. In other words, the ability to want to do the right thing, even in the face of extreme incentives to do the wrong thing. In a culture that prizes information over wisdom, it's always going to be a culture that prizes utilitarianism over something else. We've given up the concept of virtue and replaced it with tolerance. What Dorothy Sayers is the sin that believes in nothing and only stays alive because there's nothing for which it will die. We don't have a sense of actually needing to do the right thing for the good of each other. Now I say, John, where does this come from for us? Well, here it is. Christians need to get back to virtue in their discipleship conversations. I say this as a Bible college grad and a seminary grad. I had lots of ethics courses. All of my ethics courses set beside each other different ethical theories, right? Utilitarian versus non-utilitarian theories of ethics. And it was great because we were told you're supposed to choose this form of ethics and not that form of ethics. The problem is no one taught us how do you actually make good ethical decisions. We can tell people what is right, but the question is, can they do what's right? I can line up 1,800 kids every single summer down there at Summit Ministries, and I can ask them, is porn wrong? And they'll all say, yes, porn is wrong. And 80% of them are still addicted to porn, according to statistics. How do we actually move from knowing the right thing to actually doing the right thing? A moral imagination in the church and actually in the culture is anemic without it. This was very important stuff to our founders. They really played off Edmund Burke's idea of the moral imagination. In other words, there has to be the ability to imagine what is good and true and beautiful, even if we don't know the specific answers to the right and wrongness of a particular action. We actually have to have the gut, what Lewis called the chest. How is that formed? Now, what I want to talk about real quickly, I was going to give you some Solzhenitsyn stuff that sounded an awful lot like Gandalf, but I'm going to move on. One of the things we have to realize is that in the moral imagination, or in our moral imaginations, in our ethical reasonings and so on, one of the things that actually impacts us greatly is what Aristotle talked about when he talked about ethics, specifically habits. Aristotle thought that the head could rule the belly through good habits. And he said it really matters what habits we form from the earliest ages. And it makes all the difference, he said, in the world. Habits is something that we don't talk about. There was a book just a couple years ago that talked about, it was called The Power of Habit. And I think it was something like 60% of our day is habitual. It's not stuff we actually think about. It's just stuff that we just do. I'm seeing this with my kids. I don't have to think about brushing my teeth every morning and every night. I just do it. My kids don't think about it. I have to teach them. When I tie my shoe, the rabbit goes around the tree and through the hole just like it's supposed to, right? When my daughter does it, the rabbit goes everywhere, right? Because her rabbit hasn't developed habits, right? We don't think about turning into Starbucks on the way to work. It just happens to us, right? So this is the power of habits. When it comes to the cultural imagination, I would suggest that one of the things the church needs to move forward with on the whole issue of reshaping our imaginations is really paying attention to habits. I want to give you 5 categories of habits, 5 things that we don't often think about habits, but things that are impacting the cultural imagination and therefore the Christian imagination as well. Here's the first one. What are my loves? By the way, there's a book called Desiring the Kingdom that has influenced the way that I think about that, so I need to give credit to this. It's not a book that I agree with completely, but there's some really important stuff in there, I think. We don't think about loves as being habits. And if we think about loves as being emotions, they're not habits. But the classic understanding of love is essentially this. What do we habitually choose to be intimate with? Augustine talked a lot about loves, and he said two things that are really important about loves. Number one is you have to love the right things. And number two, you have to love the right things in the right order, right? When we love comfort more than morality, when we love values more than virtue, when we love cultural acceptance more than righteousness, does that make sense? Then we're loving the wrong things in the wrong order. I love, for example, my kids' happiness. I actually love it so much, I took them to Disney World this year. They loved it. I also love my kids' holiness. You ever met a kid whose parents love their happiness more than their holiness? You ever flown beside that kid on an airplane? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So loves are habitual. What do we habitually choose to be intimate with? We're seeing an unbelievable reality of this. There's some statistics coming out of Japan where 25% of young men 18 to 24 are not interested in sex. They're just not interested in sex. I'm like, who are these kids? 25%. Why? Because their life, what they have chosen to be habitually intimate with, is not another gender. It's not even another human. They're living their life where? And technology. This is really interesting. This is a generation whose imagination is being shaped by their habitual choice to be intimate with rectangles, with screens. Viagra, the manufacturers of Viagra, have found a completely new demographic for their product that they didn't anticipate when they developed it. 20 and 30-something-year-old guys. Why? Because they're so used to their intimacy being virtual that when there's another woman in the room, they can't actually perform. Their imagination has been reshaped by their habitual choice to be intimate with something else. Here's another category of habits that I think shapes imagination. Not only our loves, but our longings. If loves are about intimacies, longings are really about the world that we imagine. The things, I think this is why Jesus said, for example, if a man looks upon a woman lustfully in his heart, he's already what? Committed adultery. Why? Because he's actually longed for something that doesn't belong to him. He's already set. And see, what happens is our longings set our trajectory, right? What does our culture long for? This is the classic question of philosophy. What is the good life? This is where I think we have an amazing opportunity in the Christian worldview, to live out the Christian worldview in a culture that has such a shrunken imagination. This is a very, very real thing for me because just this past week, actually a week ago, today, I was performing or I was officiating the funeral service for my grandfather. My grandfather died when he was 92. He lived a good life. I want to be like him. His robust human life where he could play the piano and he could think and he could laugh and he could work hard. He was a piano-playing dairy farmer who helped his wife start a catering company. I mean, you figure this out. It's just unbelievable the life this guy lived. He had such a large life, and he walked with my grandmother through 72 years of marriage. And my grandmother walked with him through the last 3 difficult months, very difficult months of his life. And people would say to her silly things like, oh, you had such a good life together. And she said, I don't care, I want more. And that's exactly the way life should be, shouldn't it? Is that you should want more. And I look at that, and that is so expanded my imagination, is seeing that picture of marriage the way that it ought to be, that what I long for is not the same. I actually was in prison a couple weeks ago, not as a tenant, but I was speaking to a group of folks in a prison fellowship program in Minnesota, and I remember talking about my grandfather to them, realizing that one of the main issues with repeatable crime in the United States is the fact that they don't have a large vision of life, right? What an opportunity for Christians to touch the imagination. And by the way, this is going to come through a couple things. Two things primarily. We need some wonderful storytellers. Right? This was the power of the Cosby Show. It was a story about family and how family solved our problems, right? And it's been replaced since with story after story after story after story where family doesn't solve our problems, family what? Creates them. How do we tell really good stories that can expand the longing, the life that we think we can actually have? Here's the third one, loyalty. To me, this is huge. Loves are about intimacies and longings are about kind of the life I can imagine. Loyalties are really about my commitments. The average American right now is too busy. And all God's people said, amen. We are, aren't we? Which is great because if someone asks us to do something we don't want to do, we have a built-in excuse, which is, I don't have enough what? Time. Isn't it funny, though, we always find the time for the thing we really want to do? That's the question of loyalties. What do we habitually commit to? I'll give you a practical example in my life. And it's an example that plays itself out in yours, I'm sure, as well as your kids, as well as the broader culture. If you were to ask me right now, John, what do you love more, your daughters or your iPhone? What would I say? My daughters. If we were out on a boat and you said, you got to throw one in the ocean, you put a gun in my head, one of those has got to go in the ocean. Either your daughters or your iPhone, one of them has to go into the ocean. What would go into the ocean? iPhone. I asked a group of students that, and they were like, well, can your daughters swim? I said, no, that's not it. No, in my language, I would choose my daughters every time. But every single night, I go home after working a full day or coming back on a trip, and that stupid thing buzzes or beeps or dings me, and I make a choice. I make a choice whether to put my daughter down and pick up my phone or to put my phone down and pick up my daughter. That's the question of loyalty. We have a generation of culture whose imaginations are shrinking when it comes to relationships because of just habitual, everyday things. You say, John, what's the point? The point is this. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. In the land of the relationally inept, Christians who can embody what it actually means to love and build relationships are going to have an enormous influence in our culture. This is one of the things that I read, and it kind of hit me in the gut when we were writing this book on same-sex marriage. We have used this phrase over and over and over again about homosexuality, which is, hate the sin, what? Hate the sin, love the sinner. But in reality, if you were to put those two things on a balancing act, which one have we done more? Listen, as the church, verbally, we have hated the sin far more than we've ever loved sinners when it comes to homosexuality. I'm not saying our track record is abysmal across the board. I'm just saying, let's be honest. We can't use this rhetoric and expect it to work if we're actually not loving sinners. This is a very difficult thing for us to figure out. But you know what? At the end of the day, the God that we said, Jesus who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, also said, love your enemy. And we can't get around this. And I think this is an incredibly important thing. In fact, this is a future point, but I'm running out of time. So I wanted to tell you about this. One of the ladies, I think, who has written so powerfully on how relationally I want to say this. How much our relational imagination has shrunk in America is a woman named Sherry Turkle. You need to read Sherry Turkle. If nothing else, Google Sherry Turkle TED, the TED Talks, you know. Turkle's TED Talks are off the charts. Turkle is one of the earliest and longest running philosophers or psychologists of technology, okay? She started writing about what the computer was going to do to us back in the 80s, all right? Now, do you remember what a computer was in the 80s, right? First of all, it was an enormous calculator, right? So in the 80s, she would be in these meetings. And she told me this. I actually did an interview with her. It was one of my favorite interviews. She said, I would be in this room, and we would sit there and start to think to ourselves, how can we keep these computers busy? And right now, it's not that we have to keep our computers busy. Our computers keep what? Us busy, right? And so she would say this, and she said people would pop up, well, maybe we can put our calendars on our computers. And everyone else would say, no, it's just too easy to flip the chart, and you can erase. And, and this was back then. But in the 80s, she wrote a book in which she predicted that the computer would be more than a place where we do calculations. It would actually become a place where we get to express our identity. This is before Al Gore gave us the internet. In the 90s, after the internet, but before social media, before Twitter, even before MySpace or Facebook, she wrote another book in which she said, not only would the computer become a place where we can express our identity, the computer would become a place where we can explore alternate or multiple identities. The most stunning part of these first two books is how profoundly optimistic they are. She thought it was a great idea. She thought it was fantastic that a 50-year-old man could be an 18-year-old woman on the computer, because it would allow us to expand our understandings of ourselves and become new selves even. She didn't write another book till 2011. And let me just tell you, the optimism is gone. It might be because she has a teenage daughter. Her third book is called Alone Together. And doesn't that title say it all? There it is, Alone Together. It's profound. And by the way, all this is coming out of research. She's got a new one coming out too, which I can't wait to read. Alone Together, what she says, she's done 2 predictions. She's been 2 for 2. Her third prediction is this, that we are at a crossroads relationally where we're going to choose between having real relationships with people or having substitute relationships that are virtual. And when you start thinking about the demand in countries like Japan for artificial intelligence, where, by the way, you can actually go and rent yourself out as a family member on holidays because their birth rates have been so low for so many decades, there's not enough people. So there's a need for companionship. So now you have artificial intelligence combining with robotics. The demand for companion robots, and yes, sex robots, but really companion robots is way up. And so she's saying we're going to have to choose between having real relationships or having relationships with machines. Now, it sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? Until you realize the sort of things that she says. I mean, I remember listening to this, and I started to think to myself, when I call United, Delta takes care of me because I fly too much with them, but United, when I call United, I'd rather get the machine than the woman, right? Because they're equally unhelpful, but the machine's nicer now. And the machines apologize to you. She talks about that moment. She talks to kids and how they long for eye contact from their parents, but they don't get it anymore. Talks about that school pickup moment, when this kid runs out to your car and you look and there's that obligatory question. What was it? How was? She says, now it's this. How was your day, honey? Or the dad who only gets his kids every other weekend is pushing his kid with one hand, texting his mistress with the other hand. We can't be all there with someone at the same time. See, this is a question of loyalty, isn't it? I think this is huge. We could really make a difference in the cultural imagination of what is meant by love, what is meant by truth, what is meant by marriage, if we can actually embody proper habits of loyalties, where we actually choose people over stuff. I think we also have the question of labors. What do we work most, what do we work hard at? That's another one. I'm going to skip over that just for time. But the fifth one is just these kind of cultural liturgies. How can we get in rhythms that are different than the culture's rhythms? Here's what I mean. Liturgy, of course, is a religious word, but it just means rhythms. And culture puts us in rhythms. Rhythms where we choose machines over people. Here's a cultural rhythm. The day after we give thanks as a nation, we trample security guards for flat screen TVs. I think the church can have an amazing impact on the cultural imagination if we can embody for them different rhythms of life and human flourishing. Life that's bigger. I want to hit just a couple more things. I'm completely out of time. I already talked a little bit about being alone together, so I'll skip after that. The last thing that I want to talk about here in the time that I have, which is just another minute or so, actually 12 minutes, but I'm not going to quite go that long, is this, the cultural imagination, sex after Christianity. And I think this really plays into what we need to understand in terms of the cultural imagination when it comes to same-sex marriage. The title of this, Sex After Christianity, by the way, comes from an article that if you have not read this article yet, please read it. I think it was the finest piece of writing last year, written by the blogger Rod Dreher, Dreher, an article called Sex After Christianity. What he argues here, and it's something we should have seen, we should have known a long time ago, is that what happens with same-sex marriage is not just the end of a moral shift. What happens at same-sex marriage is the end of what he calls a cosmological shift. Let me illustrate it with a story, a cultural story. Last year, on the pages of Sports Illustrated magazine, the first openly gay man in a professional team sport who was still active came out as gay. His name was Jason Collins. He was a basketball player in the NBA. You remember this story? He talked about his choice on the pages of the magazine. People heralded him for his courage. I'm not sure how much courage it took anymore to come out like that. It doesn't seem that it takes very much. President Obama tweeted his support, I think. Personally called him, I think. The same day, Jason Collins made his announcement. Chris Broussard, who's one of my favorite NBA analysts, was asked on a TV show called Outside the Lines, which is ironically dedicated to edgy sports issues. He was asked about a particular part of Jason Collins' announcement when he mentioned that he was a Christian. And as a Christian and a gay man, he chose to focus in on Jesus' passages about Jesus' love and tolerance. You remember this. Chris Broussard was asked, because he's known to be a Christian, what do you think about specifically the point that he's Christian and he's gay? And Chris Broussard gave a response. It was calm, it was thoughtful, it was actually quite articulate, something like this. I believe, as a Christian, in what the Scripture says. And the Scripture teaches that God created sexuality to be kept between a man and a woman. And so therefore, I think any sexuality outside of the context of marriage, including homosexuality, is a sin. And of course, people blew up. I thought that was kind of funny because I didn't think he necessarily directly criticized Jason Collins as much as he kind of critiqued the sexual behavior of the entire NBA with that statement. But immediately, and you know this, here was the language. Jason Collins makes the announcement and everyone celebrates because finally he's able to, finish the line, he's able to finally what? Be himself. Chris Broussard is specifically asked about his beliefs, and even when he gives it, Chris Broussard is told, you should have never said that. Those beliefs should be kept, what? To yourself. The history of Western civilization is interesting because of its understanding of the human person. There wasn't a common understanding that everyone was in the image of God or anything like that, but one of the distinctives of Western civilization was that what it meant to be human was to be a metaphysical creature. Not necessarily religious or theological, but just that what it means to be human in a Western mindset, goes all the way back to the Greek thought and so on, is to wrestle with these kind of big questions of life. Is there a God? Is there truth? And you orient your life around these questions, right? And sexuality is to be contextualized in your answers. So who you are is metaphysical and sex is on the side. Does that make sense? That's kind of the classic understanding of the Western person throughout Western Civ, that we are metaphysical creatures and sexuality is on the side. Now, maybe we answer these metaphysical questions like a hedonist, and therefore sex then becomes to the forefront, but sex is determined by the answers to these metaphysical questions. Who we are is metaphysical, sex is on the side. In that announcement last year, we saw finally and definitively that there has been a cultural shift. Because Chris Broussard is asked about his metaphysical beliefs, and he's told you have to keep those, what? On the side. And Jason Collins makes an announcement about his sexuality, and suddenly his sexuality is not only something he does, his sexuality is someone he, what? Is. We have a brand new definition of the human person. We see the human person in the Western cultural imagination as a sexual creature. And that's what Rod Dreher means about sex after Christianity. And that's why, by the way, religious liberty is under such threat. That's why every single challenge to religious liberty has something to do with sex. We might say that the First Amendment, the first freedom, is the freedom of conscience and the freedom of religion. That's true in the documents. It's not true in the public imagination. The first and ultimate freedom in the cultural imagination is the freedom to be sexual in whatever way we want. It has triumphed. It is the triumph of the sexual definition of the human person. So what does this mean? It means when you throw out terms like the conjugal view of marriage, or that marriage has some connection to the function of procreation, that divorce happened a long time ago in the cultural imagination. This is why the language of preservation, I think it's over, guys. If I didn't believe it was over before February of this year, I do. Because of what happened at the Grammys. Talk about a cultural indicator. Now, I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say, I think. Do you remember when Miley Cyrus and Robin Thicke at the VMAs last year twerked, I think is what it's called? Do you remember it was in this obscene thing that happened at the MTV Awards? And everyone talked about it for 4 or 5 weeks. Created tons of cultural noise. Even Joan Rivers, not known to be a paragon of virtue, condemned Miley Cyrus. At the Grammys, we had the first nationally televised same-sex wedding on network TV, and no one talked about it. I do a weekly segment on The World and Everything in It, which is a radio program produced by the World News Group, who gives you World Magazine. And Nick, who I'm on with every week, he said, I went and researched this. I was trying to find out what people were saying about it. And he said, I couldn't find anyone talking about it except Christians and some conservatives. What does that mean? Here's what it means. The silence around the Grammys speaks much louder about the state of the culture than all the noise around Miley Cyrus. Because at the end of the day, you can read the cultural imagination, not by what's noisy, but by what's considered normal. No one blinked, right? I think one of the most offensive parts of the Grammys was that Macklemore, who has all the talent of Vanilla Ice, won the Artist of the Year. I mean, this tells you, right? I mean, he's not good, right? And here you had this same-sex wedding ceremony and no one talked about it. That is a huge cultural indicator. Now, what does it mean to reshape the cultural imagination? A couple things. I'll just give them to you. I had them on PowerPoint, but let me just give them to you because I need to close it out here. Unfortunately, we won't have time for questions, but I'll be happy to stick around and talk as long as you guys want to. First thing is we got to understand where we're at, right? We got to get better at reading culture. The second thing is that I'd like to offer is that as we try to move from that preservation model to the rebuilding model, what do we need? What do we need as Christians to move the cultural needle? I think we need the same thing that's always moved the cultural needle. Number one, we need really good ideas. Number two, we need champions. Champions in this generation will not be professional apologists. Champions in this next generation will be those people in everyday culture who were trained by professional apologists to live out the compelling nature of the Christian worldview in every aspect of culture. C.S. Lewis said this best. He said, we don't need more Christian books. We need more books by Christians on everything else. We know this. We're seeing this in the missions movement. The future of missions isn't pastors. The future of missions is professionals, business leaders, and medical professionals. Hobby Lobby is able to make such an enormous impact on the whole HHS conversation, primarily because they're not a Christian institution in a traditional sense, but that they employ and treat their employees so well. Do you see what I mean? We need to broaden our understanding of cultural influence. We need champions. And just like the sexual revolution, 2 categories of champions that are going to make an enormous amount of difference: educators and artists. Educators and artists. Todd Gitlin wrote a book about the 60s. Nancy Pearcey quotes this, by the way, in the beginning of her book, Saving Leonardo. After the 60s, Todd Gitlin said, the right marched on the White House and the left marched on the English departments. 10 years later, they both had what they aimed for. 20 years later, the left gets both. right? So we need ideas, we need champions, and number 3, we need artifacts. We need artifacts. We need better stories, right? We need the marriage equality meme of traditional marriage. We need creativity. We need innovation. We need entrepreneurs. And the brilliant thing about this is not only will it be compelling in a culture, but it will actually be compelling because when people are entrepreneurial, they're actually displaying the image of God inside them as God created them to display it. Really powerful stuff. So I think that's how we do it. I want to end with, you know what, I'll end with that. That'll be good. I had one more thought, but I'm out of time, so I'll end with that. I hope that wasn't too disconnected. As I said, it was a lot of thoughts kind of in progress. We try to talk about these sorts of things in these sorts of ways every single day on Breakpoint. Breakpoint was the radio program that was started by the late, and I would add great, Chuck Colson. We really miss him. He was a cultural prophet in so many different ways. One of the things I appreciated so much about Chuck is that he did very little of screaming across the line at secular culture. He did a whole lot more helping the church understand culture and clean up its own house. And I think we've got a lot of that to do. We try to continue that every day on Breakpoint. You can find that on local radio. You can also go to breakpoint.org and listen to the radio broadcast every day. You can sign up to get it on email, delivered right to you. And not only that, but you can get it on a podcast as well through iTunes. The last thing I want to share with you about one of the things that the Colson Center is doing, and I just want to share this opportunity with you. 10 years before Chuck passed away, somebody challenged him, what's going to be your legacy? And Chuck didn't want it to be a building. He didn't even want it to be Breakpoint or the Colson Center or Prison Fellowship. He felt like all those things were in decent hands. His legacy, he wanted to be people. And so he started a program, a 1-year worldview and cultural understanding leadership training program called the Centurions. It's 10 years, and we've got folks that are presidents of colleges. We've got folks who are doctors. We've got apologists. We've got people in every aspect of culture doing really, really cool stuff. God really blessed the Centurions program. Just about a month ago, I accepted to take on the next 10 years of the Centurions. And for me, it's an unbelievable opportunity to try to live out that vision that Chuck had of Christians claiming every square inch of culture, in the words of Abraham Kuyper, for Jesus Christ, with cultural understanding and cultural renewal. And so we're actually looking at taking applications right now. We take about 100 people each year, and we walk through a 1-year kind of community that's both online and in person, reading together, watching films together, wrestling through issues together. And if you're interested in joining us next year, you can find us on the web at centurionsprogram.org, centurionsprogram.org. I'd love for you to think about joining us. It's a terrific 1-year course of study. So God bless you. Should I close in prayer? Hand it over? Should I close in prayer? Is that good? Okay, thanks. Father, thanks so much for these folks who spent so much time kind of drinking from the fire hydrant of a lot of just terrific servants of yours. Thanks for my privilege of being here tonight and for the opportunity to speak to this group. Thank you so much for your love and care for us. Help us, God, to be courageous in the days to come and also wise. God, give us insight into the cultural narratives that are all around us, that are reshaping even our own thinking. Protect the heart and mind of the church, God, we pray. There's a lot of compromise happening on so many different levels, and we need your Holy Spirit. And we need your people, pastors, leaders, prophets, teachers, presidents of colleges and seminaries, to follow you no matter what. It's a new day for the church, and we're going to feel an awful lot of cultural pressure in the days ahead. So give us wisdom, winsomeness, truth, and courage to do this, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks.